rock walls are the rocks that have been borrowed from a pit 100 meters away. So that's what vernacular architecture is. And in a contemporary sense, we are trying to imitate or emulate the vernacular architecture. Then the shapes, that's concordance of materials. Then the shapes of the buildings. If you've got Zulu huts, Zulu hills, Zulu huts look like any lodge development, or what you're doing now in Corsia and that, whatever's going to be done there's got to imitate the landscape so that it suits it, so that it becomes part of the landscape. It's not an edifice which says, look at me, I'm an architecture. It says, I am the vehicle for you to be in the landscape. They're abstract concepts, but they're fascinating. The more subtle a building is, the more successful it is for the building's use. A procession, by design, you can design the procession, and as the Egyptian kings did for their death, in their death processions. The procession is an enhanced experience. So if you start off with building spaces which are subtly, unexpectedly less rather than more, and you go through the spaces in your procession to your end goal space. In the case of safari tourism, the arriving guests on their aeroplane get driven to just like a lean-to hut or a little thatched hut. And there the staff stand with champagne and a warm towel for your hands to welcome you. But you can't see anything to do with the buildings. You see this meandering path which goes into the bushveld, but you can't see where your destination is. And the staff are trained to be part of this procession, because when these very high-paying guests start becoming impatient, they want to get to their end goal, which is the lodge and their suite and so forth, and see the famous waterhole with all the elephant. They then get led by an armed guard, because there might be buffaloes and lions, and they go through this meandering path through the bushveld, come to a clearing, and there suddenly is the building, sitting in the landscape, and it's a surprise. So you've now gone from a little sala, meet and greet, little hut, to suddenly seeing something grander, with dapple shade amongst these huge jackalberry trees. And it's a surprise. There's invariably then a focus on the entrance to go into and transition through that building, of which you do that. And of course, what is of interest is what is on the other side. And as you transition through the vestibule space, onto the other side, onto a deck, there could be an enormous jackalberry tree full of vervets. 50 meters to the one side's a water hole, and there's 200 elephants drinking. I understand in some of these places, which have got this processional effect arranged by design, just like Steven Spielberg wrote scripts for movies and created dramatic effect. I understand that 1 and 2 ladies from notably Europe, when they go through this procession and they arrive at the end goal and they see this herd of elephant, which they've come thousands of kilometers to see, and they've gone through this procession of space, and there suddenly there it is. The architect has designed a procession to ultimately frame their goal of looking at the wildlife and the environment. And the architecture becomes the vehicle for that procession of uplifting the experience. So from arrival to the end goal, each space and building and portion that you go through uplifts you, and the experience gets better and better and better. For instance, compared to arriving at a lodge or a hotel, which has got this huge grand vestibule and massive gates, but then as you go into the foyer, it's not so good, and then you finally go to the dining area, it's not so good, and then you go to your room and it's even worse. So your experience is a diminishing experience. What I've been talking about is creating a procession on a vernacular basis which lifts your experience. When the first white guys met Shaka and they arrived at his enormous royal kraal at Stanger, they were astounded with that procession through the valley which protected them. And there, as far as the eye could see, were these Zulu huts with this massive boma with a gate, and you proceeded through that into the space. It was an uplifting experience. Might have been frightening too, but it was an uplifting experience rather than a diminishing experience. They knew they were going to the great Shaka kraal, but when they got there, it was 10 times more than they ever thought. Now, why can't we employ that in our architecture today by the design of processions? Architecture is the vehicle and the frame. When an artist paints a painting, the pigment and the color are the median. The brush is the vehicle, okay? A singer, the words and the music are the median, or the music is the vehicle to the median. In architecture, the buildings become the vehicle to create the focus and the frame of the space that is ultimately designed for the enhancement of the occupant. This is in tourism, but it can be applied to an office space. You go into a foyer in New York and you get into a lift and you arrive at the 95th floor and then you go into another foyer. You know, is there an outlook? Is there a focus? Is there a Stonehenge effect where the sun glances through and creates a shadow? There are all of those aspects which modern humans have completely disregarded, and the ancient or the vernacular humans regarded so seriously, which is to do with processional and spiritual spaces. And that's more or less what I'm talking about, Joe, which is the interpretation of vernacular architecture in Africa. If you're going to be designing a cottage, let's call it a beach cottage or a beach house. Yeah. Instead of starting the design as to where the car's parked and the garages and the kitchen is and how you take your potatoes to the kitchen, which is invariably where architects start designing. It's like, where are we going to park the car? You can turn that upside down and say, where are we going to put the master bedroom bed? Where is the most valuable outlook on the site? And where do I want to look? How do I want to look? And start off with your site plan and kick off by putting your bed in the best position after looking at that site. Then think about where you're going to put your main ensuite bathroom, where you're going to put the dressing behind it, and you're going to look through the mosquito net or through the arrangement, bed arrangement, through the glass at the same view. And from there, work backwards from the bedroom, the master bedroom, work backwards toward the kitchen, and then the garage, and then the entrance. Don't start with the entrance, the garage, the kitchen, the living areas, and then the bedroom. Go from the bedroom the other way around, and you might end up with a far more fabulous design solution. That's what that was about. And the relation to the Zulu hut is that when that human being builds that hut, as simple as it is, he's thinking, where am I going to put the entrance? How am I going to get there? And then once we are inside that hut, that's my place to sleep, that's my wife and children's place to sleep, that's the ancestors' place to sleep. What's important on those spaces compared to the door, compared to what's outside? He thinks about all those things. And it's the same, it's the same thing. It's just, I'm just reversing the process of you design from the bed backwards rather than from the motor vehicle to the bedroom. To create your story, to get your Steven Spielberg story in position, and then you act in terms of drawing. The 90% thought, 10% enactment creates successful and wonderful buildings, compared to 10% thought and 90% doing. You're more likely to make incorrect decisions and things. And why I allude to those guys is I think they are very great masters as to thinking something through, creating the story from A to Z as to how they want to put those things together, and creating this full script, thinking about how they're going to enact it, and then go and do it. Le Corbusier designed Brasilia, as an example. Like a writer and a movie director must write the book and then direct the movie, in my view. And I'm going to illustrate an example here. This is a building that was done for a tourist building, a lodge, a home of the Khoisan people and the red ochre naked Himba people. The landscape is a semi-arid desert with scrub trees. It's dead flat, it's featureless. There's no water, but it's got enormous amounts of game which go to a particular waterhole which formed the basis of this site. The brief was a safari lodge accommodation and a museum dedicated to rhino and natural research. There were specifics to this. Because the scrub trees were very low and it was completely flat, the architecture should not break the skyline with high roofs and thatch systems. It had to be low and flat. And of course, the lodge and the suites focus as much as possible, as the end goal is to look at a waterhole where up to 5,000 animals a day went there to drink. Okay, the story of the procession of the drama. This script or story entails interpreting the modern tourist in becoming a contemporary Khoisan bushman who's going back to his or her ancestral roots. The client is a 30-year-odd business which has been running a number of lodges in this safari area, and they bought in or agreed with creating a narrative, a story, to give the design a meaning, which again is so evident in vernacular architecture. That's what's so meaningful. The idea being that your modern tourist, who is effectively become a contemporary Khoisan, approaches their suite, which is a low wall of stone which has been picked up off the same site, with what appears to be a low sand dune roof. And in this low stone wall, there's a hole, very deep shadowed hole. And the modern Khoisan tourist enters through this hole, the same as the Khoisan would have entered their ancient caves 60,000 years ago. And once inside this modern cave, because it's been built, the curved sand dune roof on the outside then forms the inside of a cave from the inside. And in front of you is 180 degrees of glass. 5 to 10 meters out of that is the procession of wildlife. The idea being is the modern Khoisan tourist immediately sits in the shadows, unseen by the wildlife, and selects a subject, a magnificent antelope or rhinoceros. And they shoot them, but not with a bow. They shoot them with a digital camera. And in this modern cave, on the side wall is a big screen, LED, and they Bluetooth it, their images of their subjects, animals, so they can review those images, which is actually the identical thing that the Khoisan did, except they painted those images with red ochre and their fingers on the back of the cave wall. The idea being that modern man is not really different other than technology to ancient man. And by revisiting not only the procession of life, but creating it in terms of building spaces, enhances the modern tourist Khoisan visitor. It enhances the experience and makes them at one with nature, which is what vernacular architecture does. And that was the story about that's the story about how I try to employ aspects of the vernacular in a contemporary sense. You invent a story, you create the basis of why something looks like it does, why it's built like it does, and why it's arranged in certain spatial sequences as it is, to recreate the procession of the modern tourist as if he was an ancient Khoisan. I would say that South African vernacular architecture is in fact no different from vernacular architecture anywhere else in the world. Vernacular architecture has a DNA in it, or a bloodline, which is, the buildings might be different, but the response to the requirement for shelter by a human is identical. It's just the parameters vary. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, the very first vernacular buildings in the Northern Hemisphere were stone cairns. They found slate, and they also built in a circle. You know, vernacular man doesn't work in right angles. He works in efficient spaces. And efficient spaces, a circle is 30% less in distance than a rectangle. And a human can understand a circle far more easily than a right angle, because that's suddenly an abstract mathematical thing to do with the right angle. A circle is a natural response. A rectangle is an abstract mathematical response to how you make a space, okay? But the stone cairns in the Northern Hemisphere, in Denmark and Norway and United Kingdom, I'm talking about 60,000 years ago, their type of sand koi of those days, built out of stone. The reason why is because that place is freezing. So they had to do something much thicker and much more stable to take the ice and the snow. But our Himba people in West Africa and Southwest Africa and Namibia, they build the identical looking stone cairn, 2.2 meters high, 2.5 meters in diameter. It's round and it's just this like lump, but it's built out of sticks and mud. It's the identical thing. The human in Damara in northern Namibia, the human response there is identical to the human in Finland. It's just the materials and the climate are different. So what's particular about South Africa or Southern African vernacular? I would say the world's vernaculars all tie into each other because it's all got to do with the basic human response to the requirement for shelter. Right, guys, thanks much for watching. I hope you were able to learn some stuff or be inspired, and till possibly next time, thank you very much. This is Neil Hazehill.